On a fateful January 20th, 1793, the National Convention sealed the doom of King Louis XVI of France, decreeing his execution for the following day. That evening, in the shadow of his impending fate, Louis shared heart-rending farewells with his beloved wife and children. Dawn broke cold and dreary on January 21st, the air heavy with mist. At precisely 8 a formidable guard of 200 horsemen assembled to escort the fallen monarch on a somber 2-hour journey through Paris to the scaffold. By his side was Henry Edgeworth, his devoted priest and confessor, an Englishman residing in France, who chronicled the poignant moments that followed. Seated in the carriage, where words could not pass freely without witnesses, the king enveloped himself in a profound silence. I offered him my breviary, the sole book in my possession, and he accepted it with a flicker of gratitude. Eagerly, he sought my guidance to find psalms that spoke to his dire circumstances, reciting them with fervent attention. The gendarmes, silent yet visibly struck, marveled at the serene piety of their monarch, a man they had never before seen so closely. The procession stretched on for nearly 2 hours. The streets were lined with citizens, all armed, some with pikes and some with guns, and the carriage was surrounded by a body of troops formed of the most desperate people of Paris. As another precaution, they had placed before the horses a number of drums intended to drown any noise or murmur in favor of the king. Nobody appeared either at the doors or windows, and in the street, nothing was to be seen but armed citizens. Citizens all rushing toward the commission of a crime which perhaps they detested in their hearts. The carriage proceeded thus in silence to the square of Louis XVI and stopped in the middle of a large space that had been left around the scaffold. This space was surrounded with cannon, and beyond, an armed multitude extended as far as the eye could reach. As soon as the king perceived that the carriage stopped, he turned and whispered to me, "We have arrived, if I mistake not." My silence answered that we were. One of the guards came to open the carriage door, and the gendarmes would have jumped out, but the king stopped them and, leaning his arm on my knee, said, "Gentlemen," with a tone of majesty, "I recommend to you this good man. Take care that after my death no insult be offered to him." As soon as the king had left the carriage, 3 guards surrounded him and would have taken off his clothes, but he repulsed them with haughtiness. He undressed himself, untied his neckcloth, opened his shirt, and arranged it himself. The guards, whom the determined countenance of the king had for a moment disconcerted, seemed to recover their audacity. They surrounded him again and would have seized his hands. "What are you attempting?" said the king, drawing back his hands. "To bind you," answered the wretches. "To bind me?" said the king with an indignant air. "No, I shall never consent to that. Do what you have been ordered, but you shall never bind me." The path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment when, arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone, 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." He was proceeding when a man on horseback, in the national uniform, and with a ferocious cry, ordered the drums to beat. Many voices were at the same time heard encouraging the executioners. They seemed reanimated themselves in seizing with violence the most virtuous of kings. They dragged him under the axe of the guillotine, which with one stroke severed his head from his body. All this passed in a moment. The youngest of the guards, who seemed about 18, immediately seized the head and showed it to the people as he walked around the scaffold. He accompanied this monstrous ceremony with the most atrocious and indecent gestures. At first, an awful silence prevailed. At length, some cries of "Vive la République" were heard. By degrees, the voices multiplied, and in less than 10 minutes, this cry, 1,000 times repeated, became the universal shout of the multitude. And every hat was in the air. King Louis XVI was executed on January 21st, 1793. Shortly afterward, the revolutionary publication, the Daily Thermometer, inaccurately reported that the king faced his death without courage. They claimed he was forced to the guillotine at gunpoint and suffered a botched execution where the blade struck his head instead of his neck. This story was falsely attributed to the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. Outraged by the misrepresentation, Sanson released his account of the king's death. Here is his record of the king's final moments. Citizen, a short absence has prevented my response to your article concerning citizen Louis Capet. But here is the exact truth as to what passed on his last day. On descending from the carriage for execution, he was told that he must take off his coat. He gave us some difficulty, saying that they might as well execute him as he was. On our representation, that was impossible, so he himself assisted in taking off his coat. He again gave the same difficulty when his hands were to be tied, but he offered them himself when the priest who accompanied him had told him that it was the last sacrifice. Then he inquired whether the drums would go on beating as they were doing. We answered that we did not know, and that was the truth. He ascended the scaffold and advanced to the front as if he intended to speak, but we again mentioned to him that it was impossible. He then allowed himself to be placed to the instrument, from which he exclaimed in a loud voice, "People, I die innocent." Then, turning round to us, he said, "Sir, I die innocent of all that has been imputed to me. I wish that my blood may cement the happiness of the French people." These were his last and exact words. The little debate which occurred at the foot of the scaffold turned altogether on his not thinking it necessary that his coat should be taken off and his hands tied. And as a homage to truth, I must add that he bore all this with a composure and firmness which astonished us all. I am convinced that he had derived this strength of mind from the principles of religion, of which no one could appear more persuaded and penetrated. You may be assured, citizen, that there is the truth in its fullest light. I have the honor to be your fellow citizen, Charles-Henri Sanson. Sanson served as the royal executioner of France until 1795. His eldest son, Henri Sanson, who witnessed his father's work, was later recounted in Alexandre Dumas' series during a meeting around 1830. The king had been driven to the scaffold in his own carriage, and his hands were free. At the foot of the scaffold, we decided to tie his hands, but not because we feared that he might defend himself, but because we thought he might, by an involuntary movement, spoil his execution or make it more painful. So one assistant waited with a rope, while another said to him, "It is necessary to tie your hands." On hearing these unexpected words, at the unexpected sight of that rope, Louis XVI made an involuntary gesture of repulsion. "Never!" he cried. "Never!" and pushed back the man holding the rope. The other three assistants, believing that a struggle was imminent, dashed forward. That is the explanation of the moment of confusion interpreted after their fashion by the historians. It was then that my father approached and said, in the most respectful tone of voice imaginable, "With a handkerchief, sire." At the word sire, which he had not heard for so long, the king winced, and at the same moment, his confessor had addressed a few words to him from the carriage, said, "So be it then," and held out his hands. Whatever his failings as a monarch, Louis XVI met his end with a dignity that defied the expectations of his detractors. His death marked an irrevocable turning point in the French Revolution. The execution sent shockwaves through Europe, leading to the rise of new alliances and conflicts that would reshape the continent. The chaos of the revolution would ultimately pave the way for the audacious rise of a young Corsican military leader named Napoleon Bonaparte.